G'day everyone. Welcome to our seminar. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority acknowledges the continuing sea country custodianship of the Great Barrier Reef by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional owners whose rich cultures, heritage values, enduring connections and shared efforts protect the reef for future generations. Welcome to the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority National Science Week seminar. This one, we're covering a very prickly topic. We're looking at Crownathorn Starfish. My name is Paul Groves. I'm a marine scientist with the Marine Park Authority. I'll be your host for this session. If you have any questions, at the bottom of the screen is a Q&A function. If you want to type them in there, we'll look over to Julie towards the end of the seminar and try and answer as many of those questions as we can. I'm joined today by my esteemed colleagues, Darren Cameron, Dr. Jess Stella and Thea Waters. Maybe we'll start with you, Darren. Do you want to just give us a quick intro about what you do with the Marine Park Authority?
Yeah, and thanks, Paul, and great to see everyone joining us. Yeah, I'm director of the Reef Interventions section, and one of my responsibilities is looking after the Crown-of-Thorns control program. So really lucky that the Great Barrier Reef Foundation is funding the program as it moves forward, and with our partners, the Reef and Rainforest Research Centre, and ourselves and a number of COTS control vessels, we're out there and actively managing crown-of-thorns on the reef, primarily to make sure that there's plenty of live coral cover out there and we've got a healthy and resilient Great Barrier Reef.
Good, thanks Darren. Jess, we'll flick to you. Do you want to introduce yourself and what you get up to?
Hi Paul, thanks. I've been working at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority for over 5 years. I'm the manager of natural sciences, and my role is all about ensuring that reef managers have the most up-to-date science and information available to them to inform their decision-making.
Cool, thanks Jess. And over to you, Thea. Tell us about what you do at the Marine Park Authority.
Thanks. My name's Thea. I work as a permits manager within the Environmental Assessments and Protection team. So we manage all those activities on the reef that require permits and make sure that the process is easy for all those people that want to do things on the reef that do require permits.
Awesome. Thanks, Thea. So to start this off, we might actually start with Jess, but at the same time, we're going to flick over to Reef HQ and live stream a Crownathorn Starfish. And then Jess, do you want to tell us about this prickly little creature? Peter.
Sure, Paul. So I have the pleasure of introducing the Crown-of-Thorns Starfish. It is a native species to the Great Barrier Reef, so it's not introduced. It's the second largest sea star, and it can reach a diameter of about 75 centimeters. They have between 7 and 23 arms, and like most echinoderms, including sea urchins, brittle stars, other sea stars, and sea cucumbers, they have regenerative powers. If cut in half, they're able to regrow the other half of their body in just 7 weeks. They have a very prickly appearance, as you can see, and that is due to being covered with venomous spines. So each one of those spines contains a neurotoxin that's released into the skin if the spine punctures the skin. If a human gets stung, it can induce sharp pain that can last for hours, as well as cause nausea and vomiting. They're also notorious due to their diet of live coral, and this is probably of utmost importance to reef managers. So the juveniles mostly feed on coralline algae, but the adults feed exclusively on live coral, and they can consume half their body size of coral every single day. And at low densities, COTS can actually contribute to maintaining coral reef diversity by feeding on preferentially faster growing corals and creating more space for the slower growing corals, so giving them a fair chance. So although COTS are a natural part of the reef ecosystem, their densities can become so high that they can reach pest levels. And their extraordinary biology means that they have a number of life history characteristics that enable them to reach these pest level outbreak densities. One characteristic is that they have a very long pelagic larval duration. That's about 10 to 14 days from when the egg is released into the plankton to wherever they drift with the current. So that can promote a really widespread dispersal along the Great Barrier Reef. Once they settle onto the reef, they have the ability to grow rapidly. So they can reach reproductive maturity, usually within 2 years. And once they reach maturity, they're extremely fecund. So that means that they produce large amounts of eggs. The average size female can produce between 29 and 38 million eggs per season, which on the Great Barrier Reef is between October and February. And the largest sea stars, which can get up to 1 meter, possibly producing greater than 200 million eggs per season. So it's an extraordinarily fecund animal. All of these characteristics play into making them, easily able to reach outbreak levels. So during outbreaks, COTS become much less selective in their feeding. So they'll kind of choose on any coral, and that is because of the competition. And that can significantly impact reef health because the consumption rate exceeds the growth rate of corals. The consequence is often a shift from a very diverse coral reef habitat to one less diverse with less structural complexity. And loss of coral cover or reduced habitat structure has wide-ranging effects on all of the animals that depend on coral, such as fish and invertebrates. So combined with other stressors, such as climate change, coastal development, and land-based runoff, crown-of-thorns predation on corals can exert a significant pressure on the health of the reef. And that's why it's in our interest as reef managers to do all that we can to control this pest species. That's probably all I'd have to say about the biology. So if you want to move on to Darren, maybe he can tell you about the control program.
Cool. Thanks for that, Jess. That was actually really interesting stuff there. So Darren, how do you control their numbers out there on the reef?
Yeah, Paul. So at the moment, the main way in which we're controlling crown-of-thorns is basically by manual diving. So we have divers that go down and they actually inject the Crownathorn Starfish with either what we call an ox bile salt or household vinegar. And basically it doesn't leave any lasting negative impacts in terms of the marine environment, but really toxic for the starfish, and they break down in a matter of 24 hours. So that's mainly the way we're doing it, but how we do it is a lot of science involved. I'll just sort of briefly just talk about the program there, and you can see the slide up there, the objectives of the program. We're spoiled for choice in terms of the number of reefs out there in the Great Barrier Reef, having over 3,000, but we were using best available science to try and protect coral at the key coral larvae source reefs, so ecologically important reefs, and also economically valuable reefs. So we've got a lot of important tourism sites out there, really dependent on healthy coral, etc. And so we try and work with tourism operators to protect a number of those reefs and sites as well. Program originally started off as protecting just tourism sites, but now we're recognising it's one of the most scalable and feasible ways in which we as managers can get out there and really protect coral cover by, you can see there, how do we achieve it? By getting crown-of-thorn numbers below ecologically sustainable levels, so that, as Jess said, we want the coral growth to outpace the starfish feeding. And as she said, they do eat a lot of coral when they're in the outbreak phase, when their populations are really high. What we're not trying to do, we're not trying to eradicate crown-of-thorns. As Jess said, they're natural out there in the Great Barrier Reef, and in their normal populations probably perform an important ecological role in maintaining the balance and diversity of coral species out there. We're also not about achieving a high body count. We're about biggest bang for the buck that we got with our coral COTS control vessels out there in the marine park. And we're not trying to stop the outbreak. We're trying to suppress it over time, but it's about managing it to ensure we've got a good, healthy coral cover out there in the marine park. People ask what the vessels do. So at the moment, we've got 5 vessels out there in the marine park, and they undertake a variety of activities, some of which, as you can see on the right-hand side there, is the actual culling or killing of the starfish. But in order to do that, we really depend on a lot of good science. So with our science partners at the, mainly through CSIRO, James Cook Uni, U of Q and AIMS, we've got some really great science in which we do surveys of the reef to determine what the crown-of-thorns abundance is and whether we need to manage it. And you can see there, we also undertake a number of reef health surveys. And whilst these boats are doing all that work, there's a fair bit of support for a lot of the innovative crown-of-thorns research that we need to happen out there as well. So, you know, if we're still doing this in a manual way, controlling crown-of-thorns starfish like this in a decade, you know, we probably think we've failed. So we're trying to work out more innovative ways with our science partners. And again, with the Great Barrier Reef Foundation funding that recently been received, we're looking at, they're looking at different innovative ways in which we can move forward. So looking at things like pheromones, where crown-of-thorns, you know, might be attracted to a small area and increase numbers so they're easier to manage, things like that. Just a bit of an example, a couple of the reefs that we've worked on over time and how we've achieved really good things with our COTS control vessels. Here we have a reef off Mission Beach here, and on the left-hand side, you can see in February 2019, you can see the red dots there represent where we've got an outbreak numbers of Crownathorn starfish. After our vessels worked there hard with all the divers over a few months, you can see there, they killed 4,600 starfish. And over time, they basically reduced that really severe outbreak level on that eastern side of the reef, so that then we didn't see any crown-of-thorns. So, you know, it was a really good outcome for a reef. So we've got, you know, luckily for us, we've got a lot of examples of this sort of success. Here's another example where we've got John Brewer Reef, really important reef for recreational and tourism use, as well as commercial fishing off Townsville. And you can see there, when they did a manta-toe, they got 3.5 crown-of-thorns that they saw per manta-toe. So that's, manta-toe is about 200 metres long, takes about 2 minutes usually. And as you can see there, that reef was in severe outbreak status based on the best available science that we have. Then subsequently, after a lot of work by our Pacific Marine Group, which operated at Townsville as one of our Crown-of-Thorns contractors, they did a lot of culling, over 40-something thousand Crown-of-Thorns starfish killed. And as you can see, a year later, that reef was really reduced down in terms of COTS numbers, down to no outbreak status. So fantastic work, but again, really dependent on the science that provides advice to us in terms of how to manage these reefs. One of the big things that we do differently from 18 months ago is we have to do repeat visitation. So imagine your yard, if you don't weed it, particularly in the tropics, for 12 months, you get a lot of weeds back. So from a Crown-of-Thorns perspective, we're always actively working on these reefs, and we've got more frequent repeat visitation back to these areas. Just in terms of where we're operating, just in terms of, here's a bit of a map of the GBR, and you can see there in terms of the bright red circles, there where we've still got some severe outbreaks on a lot of reefs, and in the central GBR adjacent to Townsville there, and also we've got some outbreaks that were down in the Capricorn Bunker Group down off Gladstone area. So we've got 5 vessels operating up and down the coast, and this is where they've been working, and again, really achieving some great outcomes, reducing some of these reefs below outbreak status, and also making sure we're maintaining some of these reefs in a healthy populations of starfish below what we consider that outbreak level. Yeah, no, it's great work, and we're just so lucky to have the funding to support this really valuable work out there to, you know, maintain coral cover across a lot of these important reefs.
Well, thanks, Darren. That's great work, and it's a big job you've got ahead of you there. Well done. Thea, if I'm out on the reef and I see Crownathorn starfish there, am I allowed to cull them myself, or do I need permissions to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So with the findings that that household vinegar can actually do a really good job at controlling the crown-of-thorns populations. It's made it easier for just the general public to be able to themselves go out and do these culling activities. And it's particularly great because that vinegar, as Darren said, does have no lasting effect on the environment. In general use habitat protection zones and conservation park zones, so that's the light blue zones, the dark blue zones and the yellow zones in the marine park, you can actually go out there and do COTS control yourself without a permit. You just need to make sure that you follow, we've got some COTS control guidelines that Darren's team and other experts have pulled together. And those guidelines make sure that you're doing the COTS control in a way that's going to minimise harm to yourself and make sure that you're not reproducing or causing regeneration of crown-of-thorns starfish, and just do it in a way that's been scientifically proven to be effective. If you do want to do COTS control on marine national park zones or buffer zones, so those are green and olive zones, you will need a permit from us, but that's not necessarily something that's difficult to get. We do have a routine permit that's available for COTS control, and they require you to apply through Permits Online. It's a quick process, and because it's a routine permit, it's very streamlined. A lot of tourism operators use those permits to do site stewardship at the reefs that they frequent. Yeah.
Cool, excellent. Thanks for that, Thea. Julie, I might just flick to Julie and see, have we got any questions there in the Q&A that we want to ask our presenters?
One of the questions, yes, was, do crown-of-thorns have any positive roles that they play on the reef?
Who would like to answer that?
Jess, do you want to have a crack?
Yeah. I mentioned earlier that during non-outbreak periods, crown-of-thorns do play an important role in maintaining coral species diversity. So they mainly feed on tabular acropora or other acropora and polyleporic corals that are fastest growing on the reef. By doing that, they allow extra space for the slower growing corals. So they kind of take away a little bit of that competitive advantage that acroporas have. It's really only when they get to outbreak proportions that that whole thing kind of caves down. But under normal densities, which are pretty low naturally, they can play a role in maintaining coral species diversity.
Cool, that's great. Thanks for that, Jess. Julie, is there any other questions you want to throw to these guys?
Yes, are there any natural predators to the crown-of-thorns?
Very, very good question.
Very good.
Do you want to answer that one, Darren, or Jess?
Yeah, I'll have a go. I think between Jess and myself. Yes, so one of the giant Triton, a large marine gastropod, it's been well known to be a predator of Crownathorn starfish, and there's some great footage on the AIMS website where as soon as a giant Triton gets in close proximity to a Crownathorn starfish, the Crownathorn starfish, which usually don't move too fast, really try to rapidly get away from being eaten by the giant Triton. And so, that's one of the things that the Crownathorns vessels actually are assisting AIMS in terms of monitoring numbers. So whenever they see giant Triton out in the reef, which we believe are in greatly reduced numbers compared to what they were, 30, 40, 50 years ago, they record that. So they're an important predator, and those species of Triton, they've been protected for the last 30 to 40 years. And yeah, really important for, keeping the Crownathorn starfish under control. And recently there's been some great research too, led by the Australian Institute of Marine Science, where they looked at a number of fish species to see which of those species out there in the coral reef environment might predate on Crownathorns at different stages in their life history. So a number of new species that they identified that no one knew that fed on Crownathorns, including some that were commercially and recreationally important species. So, from that leading into the importance that we need, good sound fisheries management, not just to support good, healthy reef fish numbers out there, but it's good to have some of these fish species out there in good numbers because they're likely to also play a role in managing the balance in terms of Crownathorn starfish populations out on the reef.
Cool. Thanks, Darren.
I should say that innovative research they did in that way was all on fish poo. So it was looking at DNA of COTS, and they basically collected a lot of fish, held them in tanks, collected the fish feces, and then from that went on to see whether there was crown-of-thorns DNA in that fish feces. And obviously they'd done a lot of work back in the lab so that, they had a good proof of concept that that was a good scientific methodology to use. So really innovative research led by the Australian Institute of Marine Science that really helps us in management.
And a fun job too. Julie, you got another question there for us?
Yeah, we actually have quite a few questions coming up in the question and answers. So one of them is, what is considered to be an outbreak level?
Cool. Darren, I might fix you that one.
Yeah, so can we just go back to that presentation? So on that slide I just showed you, we've got a number of metrics that we use to determine outbreak status. And I'm just trying to go back. And as you can see there at the bottom of this slide, you can see there that we've got average numbers of crown-of-thorns per manto on the left. So as you can see there, if we've got greater than 1 crown-of-thorns that we see in a manto, one of the metrics we use, that's a severe outbreak. If it's greater than 0.22 crown-of-thorns that we see, we class that as an established outbreak. And as you can see, we go down to the no outbreak status. So we really want to get less than 0.1 of a crown-of-thorns that we see in a 200 metre, approximately 2-minute manto. That's what we're aiming to get down to when we do the control activities out on the reef. You can see in this instance, we talked about Eddy Reef, we've got 0.31 crown-of-thorns per manto, and that's seen as that established outbreak, just below severe, but just the established. And then we get down to 0 crown-of-thorns after we've actively managed and controlled that reefs. The John Brewer situation, which I talked about before, as you can see, it was 3.5 crown-of-thorns, per manto. So it was 10 times the density of crown-of-thorns on John Brewer than on Eddy Reef when we first started managing that reef. And again, that's why we've had to, our COTS control vessels have to work very hard to get those numbers of crown-of-thorns right down, and they got it down to below that 0.1, so down to the 0.08 crown-of-thorns per outbreak. And then we can look at that reef and make sure that, yeah, we've achieved what we need to. So again, back to that aim at the beginning, so that coral growth outpaces the predation on coral by the crown-of-thorn starfish.
Cool. Thanks, Darren. Julie, what else have we got for us?
Okay, this one is for Darren, and it says, can Darren please provide a bit more detail of the science that's used to select the reefs and the target locations?
Yeah, so we're really lucky to have a great partnership with all of our science providers and the National Environment Science Program, and I mentioned some of those institutions before that feed into that. We're lucky we have a fair bit of, and it's scientific modelling based on the best available data that we have, looking at the connectivity that we have between different reefs. So, this is a really important reef here. It provides a lot of baby coral larvae that then move out and populate a number of other reefs. And, that's considered like, the word super spreader gets used a fair bit. That's a great spreading reefs for coral. And also, we've got a fair bit of information in terms of which reefs are important for distributing crown-of-thorns larvae. And as Jess said before, one of the things we're mindful of them being successful is that they have a long pelagic life history. They're a long time alive in the water column before they settle. So we've got a lot of modelling data over a number of years, and that helps us narrow down the importance of different reefs. We then look at other data such as we talked about before that's the ecological perspective. We look at from an economic perspective in terms of the importance to tourism reefs, and we gradually narrow down the number of the reefs that we think we should be prioritising to get the biggest bang for buck to address that ecological and economic objective. That's what we try to do. At the same time, then we'll then subsequently work in with the COTS control providers and think about logistically, is this reef at a depth that can be adequately managed? Is it exposed to severe wave action most of the time because it's on the edge of the reef? So all those factors then come in as we isolate the number of reefs down so we can get biggest bang for the buck with the resources that we have across all of the GBR.
Cool. Thanks, Darren. And I guess with 3,000 reefs out there, keeping a handle of what's going on each of the reefs is important. GBRMPA has the Eye on the Reef sightings app, which is certainly used for this sort of information as well to help providers help see where the crown-of-thorns are. So please, if you're out on the reef, download that and use that to feed information into it. It does get used by the program. Julie, what else have you got?
Oh.
Yeah, this one goes back about the predators of crown-of-thorns. So you mentioned about a snail that was a predator. So the question was, why are the snail numbers down and are there predators of them?
So in terms of giant triton, there's a fair bit of anecdotal historical evidence that in the 50s and 60s, that giant tritons were harvested in very large numbers of bycatch in commercial fishing industries. And they were subsequently protected. I think the fishing industry had a fair bit to do with that protection back then because they thought, oh, a lot of these giant tritons are being caught. You know, is this sustainable? And so over time, they were pretty well quickly protected. I think they were one of the first animals protected in the 1970s, the giant triton, under Queensland fisheries legislation back then. But, you know, there's stories of, you know, hundreds of these animals being landing on shore from commercial fishing vessels for their ornamental value back in the 60s. And since that time, looking at the life history of them in terms of their longevity out on the reef, you know, the numbers have not bounced back despite them being protected for a really long period of time.
Thanks, Darren. Okay, Julie, what else have you got?
Someone is asking if there was any online course or training or information available about the science of cod removal using the vinegar method.
We haven't got an online training as such. You know, if people can look at the GBRMPA website, and they can see there that there's a number of different materials that they can refer to, bringing them up to date, like all this information that we're talking about. We have a COTS strategic management framework that we've just published. And then there's the guidelines that Thea referred to before, but we haven't got an actual online video example of how to do it at the present time.
Cool. Thanks, Darren. Julie, back to you.
Okay, keeping going. So is there has any scientific research found any uses for COTS, and also can you eat them? Two questions there.
Jess,
that might be good.
Yes, I've talked enough. Jess?
Yeah, Jess, do you want to answer that one? You got any good recipes?
I guess you could eat them. I don't know why you would want to. I can't imagine them tasting very well. They don't have a lot of flesh to them. They have a water vascular system, so a lot of their body cavity is just seawater. I can't think of any reason why they would be useful to science.
I mean, stars and stripes pufferfish like them, as we've talked about with the AIMS research in terms of what fish, but there's other fish that spangled emperor, for instance, like eating them. In terms of use, we do get an inquiry every now and then. Oh, you know, there's lots of them out there, and I want to assist the marine environment to be healthy out there on the GBR. Where can I get rid of them, sort of thing? But at this time, I'm unaware of any demand or use for them for any good purpose, other than the role that they play in you know, maintaining the ecological health of the Great Barrier Reef when their numbers are at normal levels.
Thanks, Darren. Julie, what else have you got?
So this one's to Jess. Someone was interested in knowing what you studied to become a doctor. So what sort of science were you doing?
I did my PhD at JCU in Townsville, and I looked at the effects of climate change on coral-associated invertebrates. So it didn't include COTS, but it includes one of the animals that actually can protect a coral home against a COTS predator, which are the coral guard crabs of the species Trapezia, the genus Trapezia. So there's a few species on the GBR. They live in branching coral their entire lives, and they actively defend their coral host from predation by crown-of-thorns by pinching their tube feet off, and they can actually break their spines off. And crabs are only about 1 centimeter wide compared to, at least a 1/2 meter for crown-of-thorns. So yeah, that's what I did my thesis on. And that was, a few years ago now, but I still have a healthy respect for the coral guard crabs and the important role that they do on the reef.
Excellent. Thanks, Jess. Julie, next question.
So now we have another question. It was to Thea then. So they're wondering about your career and did you do studies as well?
Yes, I did. I also studied at James Cook University, where I did my undergraduate and my master's in marine biology and ecology. And following that, I moved on to GBRMPA and have worked in the same section, but different roles within the section for the last 5 years. So mainly permits with a marine background.
Cool. Thanks, Thea. Julie, next question.
So apart from culling COTS, are there any other ways that we can help to control the outbreak numbers?
Any other ways apart from killing the crown-of-thorns?
Yes. Is there any things that people can do to help?
Anything that anyone does in terms of contributing to a healthy Great Barrier Reef environment, contributes to, a healthy system, including the crown-of-thorns numbers. So, best science indicates, there may be some linkages in terms of the crown-of-thorn outbreaks. Historically, we've had 4 big outbreaks since the 1960s that generally start up in the Lizard Island to Cairns area and then gradually, progressively head south. And so we're at the end of that, I think the 4th sort of big outbreak now, as it goes through the central GBR. In terms of what you can do, obviously there's a bit of a connection, the science indicates, between good catchment management on land in terms of nutrient outflow. So, all the farming communities along the GBR are really mindful of the importance of their improved agricultural practices that is improving the, water quality, reduced nutrients flowing into the GBR. And, those farming industries have been improving those practices for a number of years and are really active in supporting in that role. And again, we've referred to some of the important predators in terms of the fisheries recently. For instance, for a number of those species such as spangled emperor, recently there's been some improved fisheries management in terms of total allowable catch limits that have been introduced for some of those species that are fished, but we believe also play an important part in reducing and maintaining crown-of-thorns numbers.
So I guess zoning would help that as well.
And obviously the zoning contributes to that, Paul. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Darren. Okay, Julie, next question.
So I'm just going to ask the last 2 questions, and then I'll pass back to you for final messages. One of them was, can COTS be used as fertiliser when buried on land? So I'm not sure about that one. And the other question was a Reef HQ question about what do we feed COTS at the aquarium if they eat corals. So 2 questions there, and then after you've answered that, we'll head back to Paul.
I'm not sure in terms of use of fertiliser. As Jess said, by virtue of their physiology, once they're injected, they decompose very quickly and you're just left with a decaying bit of, the body. And then you've just got the calcareous spicules, the spikes that are sort of left. So I dare say that, there may be some opportunities, but they're so heavy, you know, when they're in the water, and you've got to be very careful because they're the only, you know, toxic echinoderm that's out there on the GBR. So if you get stung by them, you know, you can get, you know, severe infection, etc., in terms of handling them when they're live in the marine environment. So I'm not aware of any possibility to be fertilizer out there, but I'll probably leave that to the agricultural specialist from a fertilizer perspective.
Darren, we have heard of people that have requested collection of COTS for fertilizer, but once again, not our specialty area around how good they are as fertilizer. Yeah.
And I guess the other question there was, what does Reef HQ feed them? Jess, did you want to answer that one?
Well, it's been a while since I was at Reef HQ or as a volunteer in my early days. I do know that they can eat other things. So they can eat bits of fish, and they're really remarkable animals in that if they go months without eating, they will not just simply starve to death. They'll weaken, they can grow, so they can get smaller, but it would take a lot to kill them. So just feeding them a bit of fish can keep them alive for a very long time.
Cool, excellent. Okay. Well, thanks for that. Thanks to everyone, to Darren, to Jess and Thea for presenting, and thanks to Jules for doing the behind the scenes. I guess the key takeaway message from this is that Crownathorns are a native to the reef, but when they get out of control, when they get into big numbers, then they become a problem, cause massive damage, which is certainly of a concern now that we have other impacts such as climate change affecting the reef. Once again, if you do see Crownathorns out on the reef, I do encourage you to download the sightings app as part of the Eye on the Reef program. It's on iTunes and through the app stores, and put those sightings in because they do use that information. So that's it for this seminar. Thank you very much. I do encourage you to jump on and check out the other in the series as we go through this week. And yeah, thank you for being part of this seminar. Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.